cars age as well, and they age differently. Sometimes cars age like, well, as you would say, fine wine, and they actually get better looking and even cooler with age. But other times they start off being desirable cars, and then very quickly you realize, yeah, they're not so great, either in terms of aesthetics or design or engineering or the drive, whatever it is, and they quickly fall out of favor. So I've been looking at what cars were kind of cool when they came out, and now you wouldn't be seen dead in them. Which ones have I come up with? These are the ones I've come up with. I'm going to tell you all of those right after this. In the meantime, start to think about the cars that you think fall into this category and start putting those into the comments.
A brown car guy. Brown car guy.
So let's start with the Vauxhall Calibra. This thing was from 1989 to 1997. Now, I was never that much of a Vauxhall fan. I'm probably a bit more of a Ford fan, but every now and then something would come along. VX220, which is basically an Elise, and then the hot ones, the V8 powered ones, they were good. I quite liked the Omega V8 for a while. I had a bit of a soft spot for that. But around this time, they came out with the Vauxhall Calibra. And this thing looks it's all in white especially, it looks spectacular. It looked really sleek, really smooth. Aerodynamically, it was amazing. It had one of the lowest coefficients we'd ever seen at that time. So it was a real head turner. I did get to drive one around that time. It wasn't great. You know, because basically underneath it was, what was it? Was it a Cavalier or... Well, it was basically the saloon version, wasn't it? It wasn't, you know, so to drive, it wasn't really all that special. So we're not talking like a car that, you know, it wasn't really, I think, what did Ford have at the time? Must have been maybe the Probe. But there were lots of really nice coupes out. So there was a Peugeot 406 coupe, which was, you know, the best looking thing this side of a Ferrari. In fact, it pretty much was a poor man's Ferrari. It's gorgeous. So just outdid the Calibra in terms of looks, and it was a Peugeot, and it drove pretty well. And then something else that also drove really well, and I'd put it just fractionally underneath that Peugeot, was the Prelude of this time, the Honda Prelude, because again, I just thought it looked gorgeous, had this kind of nostril thing going on, really sleek, very smooth. I thought it was great. And the Calibra should have really easily sat amongst those amazing coupes, especially this was a big era for coupes, but it really wasn't that great. And honestly, now when you look at it, you know, it doesn't quite do it anymore, does it? So yeah, it's a shame. But the Calibra, I thought was really cool at the time. Not so cool now. You remember in the Gulf War, we were introduced to the Hummer. The Humvee, actually. And the Hummer H1 is the one that the Army actually used. And those are big, tough, massive beasts, you know. Huge, hulking great things, you know. Diesel powered, not very powerful, but very torquey. They just go on and on and on forever and ever. And they would supposedly withstand a landmine. That was the whole thing about them. So to cash in on that, GM put out, you know, civilian versions, if you like, you know, while the likes of Hummer, likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger, for example, were driving the H1 around. They thought, let's make something that's a bit more civil, because honestly, it wasn't very civilized inside. There was a huge, and there was a lot of wasted space inside as well. But let's put out something that was a bit more civilian. So they put out the H2, and the H2 was pretty massive. I mean, I remember, like, I hadn't seen one. I was in the Middle East. I was here in the UK, and there used to be a motor show in the Docklands at that point, and they advertised that there was one going to be there, and I went down to look at it, and this thing was humongous. It was like ridiculous, you know. And then later on, they introduced the H3, which had all the looks of a large car, but actually wasn't that big. And both these cars were actually just based on the existing generation pickups, like the Sierra or whatever, you know. So they weren't actually, underneath, they were just regular cars that had just been bulked out to look like these big Hummers. At the time, they had amazing presence. They had the style, the looks, they felt like they had the substance. But honestly, they weren't all that. I remember doing a review of actually being on the launch of an H3 in Dubai. And I remember they were taking us on an off-roading course, so we did with all the journalists. So we were doing an off-roading route, and we were in the desert. And the instructor that was with me, who was like, "Oh yeah, you know, this is a proper off-roading. You know, we're proper off-roading because this desert, right? This is this is hard stuff here. You know, it's really hard for cars to come here. So any car to come here, you know, it shows how good they must be when they're off-road." And I was like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah." And then we came over that particular crest, and down on the other side, at the bottom of that crest, was a BMW 7 Series saloon. The guy shut up pretty quickly, and it was because somebody had literally, like, it must have been a local Bedouin or a farmer or a local Emirati farmer or something like that, and he'd driven his 7 Series to that place in the desert and just gone off, you know, to visit his farm or his camels or whatever. And we did a loop, and when we came back across the same bit, and the car had gone, so it hadn't been dumped there. He'd literally driven it there and then driven it back. So, you know, so much for that. But that's not to negate that it was in any way a bad off-roader, but it wasn't quite the thing that they thought that, or they wanted us to believe it was. And I think that they have also now become very quickly quite stale in a sense, really. They don't really have the presence or the impressiveness that they used to have. Although to see an H2 in London even now would be like, whoa, that's big. But do you want to be seen in one of those? Doesn't really fit the mood in the moment, does it? I've often said that the coolest car on the planet, bar none, is not your Ferraris, your Lamborghinis, or anything like that. It is the ultimate blue-collar hero muscle car, the Ford Mustang. I'm a huge Ford Mustang fan. You know, when you look back at the originals, you look back at the 60s generation cars, I mean, they were just incredible. They were iconic, you know, from the Bullet Mustang to the Elan Mustang. They just look amazing. When we got to the 1970s, you know what? I'll still give it to you, because in 69, 70, we had the Mach 1, we had the Boss 302, obviously John Wick had, I think his was a 1970 Mach 1. So these, and they had presence, they had style. I'll go as far as 1973, where, okay, the looks not quite there, but still, it had presence, it had like the substance to it, it had sort of a magnificence to it, right? So that, so like this this 73 car. But then the thing is, we went from this to this in 1974. And I know that Farrah Fawcett sitting on it will make it look a lot cooler, but take Farrah Fawcett away and look at this thing and you'll be like, what happened? This is the Mustang 2. Call it a misstep, call it whatever you like. But you can understand that this was the mid-70s. And at that time, of course, you know, they wanted to try and downsize stuff. They wanted to make things more fuel efficient because we had the fuel crisis and all the rest of it. So they were trying to change what the Mustang was about. But this thing just looks ridiculous. It has no presence, it has no style, and it doesn't look very desirable. It doesn't look very muscly. It doesn't look, you know, very powerful. And to be honest, even the one after that, so the Mustang 2 is probably one of the most hated generations of Mustangs, but even after this one, so moving on to the third generation car, which was 1979, what's this? This is like a retirement homes Mustang. I mean, what is this? What happened here? Fortunately, they kept working on this. I think they started to realize, they kept tweaking and improving it until you got to around 1987, when you had the 5.0. Isn't this the one that Vanilla Ice had? I think the white convertible 5.0. I think it's this one, right? By that time, it started to look a little bit more interesting and exciting, and it's a bit more 80s and something that you could desire. And of course, by the time we got to the next one, 1994, the SN95 Fox body Mustang, these were actually quite sleek and quite interesting. And to be honest, I think they're getting quite desirable now, the Fox ones. And then, of course, we moved to 2005 when we got the reboot of the Mustang in a kind of original 60s iconic style, which, of course, has led to the current generation of great Mustangs that we now have. But yeah, Mustang 2, don't want to be seen with one of those. Hey, are you enjoying this video? Then make sure you hit the like button. It's very important. Plus, comment, share, and make sure you're subscribing. Right then, do you remember this thing? Skoda Octavia VRS. I think there was about late 90s up to almost 2010, I think. And these one, I remember driving one of these for a magazine in yellow. I think it was a group test. These were basically a Mark IV Golf underneath, right? But with performance and maybe a little bit more. And it was a great car, you know, with a boot and saloon. It was like a cooking saloon. It was really cool. And at the time, you know, these were, and they were like, if you think about it, you could buy the Skoda and the Seat versions of their cars were basically cheaper and somehow slightly better versions of the Volkswagen equivalent. So if you had like the Volkswagen GTI, instead of buying that, you bought something like this, and you were like, oh, okay, I got it for less, plus it's a saloon, plus it's got a boot, and it's kind of better. And so same thing like with the, say, the Uncool and stuff like that. So, but these things, they came out and they looked, I mean, they had the square, chunky, handsome sort of look about them. They were nice to drive and they were pretty cool at the time. And at the time you'd be like, yeah, definitely want one. But I have to say that now it looks about as exciting as an old office printer. Let's be honest, it just doesn't do it anymore, does it? It's kind of, it looks a bit frumpy. It looks a bit aged, really. It looks a bit like of its time, and there isn't any, you look at it and it just looks like an ordinary saloon. It doesn't look like there's anything unusual or different or exciting or intriguing about it, unless of course you find a yellow one. But other than that, even the red one I don't think will look all that special. It just kind of feels cheap and not very desirable now. It's a real shame, because at the time I remember it was a great car, but now, yeah, no thanks. I remember when this thing was actually shown in concept, guys, at a motor show, and the world went crazy. They were like, the Beetle, it's got what had been the world's best-selling car, is coming back, and it's coming back in this new modern form, which had basically been drawn using a protractor or a compass, you know. And it was just an extraordinary thing. And the concept was great. It was well received. People loved it. So Volkswagen were like, okay, let's quickly rush this into production. And it came out and they had a little vase inside it and stuff like that. And initially it did well, but very quickly people thought, actually, it's just a compromised Golf, because it's not as practical, it's not as spacious. The engine isn't in the back where it should be with the Beetle. It's in the front, because underneath it was just a Golf. And after a while, that shape, that design, that looked so interesting and so unique on this rotating platform in the middle of the motor show with all the lights and the glare of the world on it, suddenly very quickly became kind of like, that's a bit weird. That's a bit, and you know, I suppose it didn't help that Barbie had one, so it became very toy-like. It became very, something that didn't really appeal. So that car, I think, became uncool very, very quickly. It was a big misstep on the part of Volkswagen, which really should have been able to capitalize it. And don't forget on this, and don't forget, this was coming out at the time the retro was becoming a big thing, because around the same time we had the Mustang came out, 2005 Mustang. I think that was a bit later, I think, perhaps, but that came out. But I think, and also in 2001 we had or 2000 actually, the new Mini came out. So that basically was a retro Mini. So it had the new design, new body, bigger, but looked like a Mini. Same with the Mustang. So maybe the Beetle kind of kicked it off and then kind of failed. And then these guys came in and they kind of really worked that whole retro theme and made it really happen. Whereas Volkswagen, they faltered. So it's a real shame. But yeah, that car, not very cool now. As you know, some of you will have seen in a recent episode or the last ever episode of the Grand Tour. I'm not going to say anything more because I don't want to spoil it if you haven't seen it, but it's kind of funny. So look at this thing, the Pontiac Solstice. And this was kind of like America's response to things like the very, very successful Mazda MX-5 or Mazda Roadster, Mazda Miata as they called it over there in America. And you know, it looked the part. You know, the curvy looks, the compact design, you know, the Pontiac, even the front grille, I didn't mind. I thought, you know, it kind of gave it character, kind of gave it personality, but it wasn't really that great to drive, honestly. I haven't driven it myself, but from all the reviews and everything that came out at the time, it wasn't actually put right up there. It definitely was a very low bar competitor to the brilliance of something like the Mazda MX-5, and then of course the Lotus Elan came out, the new generation Lotus Elan, or the modern one that looked like a little pyramid on wheels. That came out. Actually, that's another one I should have included on this list, really, because it's a little bit naff now, isn't it? The Elan. Is that sacrilege? Should I say that? Am I going to get a lot of hate from me? Probably. And I'm a Lotus fan. And I remember I had an amazing experience in that Lotus. I've got an incredible story to tell with that Lotus Elan. You know what? I'm suddenly impromptu. That wasn't on my list, but I'm impromptu going to include that now on this list. And let me just come back to that. With the Solstice, just to conclude that, even the build quality wasn't that great. And, you know, it just became the butt of jokes. And, you know, now that car is dead. And yeah, you don't want to be seen in one. The Lotus Elan, which has just popped into my head now. I remember going to the Lotus factory around 1991 when it came out, and getting to drive that thing round the track at the back and thinking like this. And because at the time they said, you know, because the best handling front-wheel drive car, there's only two that get that accolade. One of them is the Honda Integra Type R, which is still a desirable, hot, brilliant car, and the other is the Lotus Elan, because of the incredible engineering. Isuzu engine, but all the setup and everything was done by Lotus. I think it was Isuzu engine. And I remember being driving around the track, incredible, and then taken around the track by a Lotus test driver in the pouring rain, where it was aquaplaning, you couldn't see anything, and he was just playing with it. I mean, he was just scaring the crap out of me because it was just so manageable. It was just so nice to drive and stuff like that. And for a long time, I desired one of those. I was like, wow. I mean, it was kind of like a wedge shape. I love the wedge shape, the whole Esprit wedge shape thing. And it kind of had this sort of futuristic space poddy kind of look. I really liked that. But Honda did it so much better in the Civic that came out a few years later. But anyway, the Elan, let's stick with the Elan. The Elan itself, at the time, it did look incredible. It did look futuristic. It did look contemporary. But after a while, it just kind of, it never really had the grace or the elegance, the style and the sexiness. That's the one thing that was missing from it, is the sexiness of something like a Mazda MX-5. So, I think today, they're not exactly lusted after, are they? And to find like a good quality one, I think would be quite hard. I still think it'd be a tremendous fun car to drive. I think in that sense, there would be no competition. I think it'd be amazing to drive even today. But in terms of the looks and the style, yeah, not so much. Yeah, I might have really put the cat amongst the pigeons with that one. I'm looking forward to the comments. Let's move on quickly. The Mitsubishi Pajero. Did I say Mitsubishi right? Mitsubishi Pajero, or Shogun as we called it here, because Pajero in Spanish meant something that I can't say. So we called it Shogun here, but everywhere else in the world it was known as the Pajero. I remember back in the day, the Pajero, we're talking probably 90s, something like that. But for example, in Pakistan, the Pajero was the boss's car. It's like, if you had it, like all the feudal lords, they all had, all the MPs, all the ministers, the VIPs, they all had Pajeros. If you had a Pajero, you were like the man, the boss. You had a Pajero, you were special. And they were proper cars. But today, the thing with the Pajero, I think, is that it outlived itself. Mitsubishi, for want of not having anything else to sell, they just dragged it on and on and on, pretty much unchanged, to the point where it just became this old tractor of a thing that was just completely undesirable. So like now, really, they are, I mean, if you have an old classic Pajero that you think is really cool, I'd still give you the nod of respect. But overall, as something that's desirable, unlike, for example, say an old Land Cruiser, which are kind of cool, I don't think a Pajero is cool anymore. Anything other than an Evo, sorry. So if you got a Pajero Evo, Shogun Evo, those were quite special. But anything other than that, nah. So that's definitely not cool anymore. Sticking with the off-roaders, SUV type of things, do you remember this thing? The Isuzu VehiCROSS, cross with capital letters, Isuzu VehiCROSS. I mean, this thing looked incredible when it came out. It was quirky, it was different, it was unusual, but it was chunky, and it was kind of futuristic, and it was kind of like a science fiction version of an off-road car. That's kind of what it looked like. And I thought it was quite cool. But looking at it today, it doesn't really look that. First of all, it didn't do that well. There are not that many around. I don't think I've ever seen one really. Perhaps at the time, but in a motor show or something, but not since. But now it kind of looks, the proportions are a bit off. The cladding looks like it's going to fall off the car. It just, the wheels are too small. It just, I don't know. It just kind of like, it hasn't aged well. So futuristic at the time, but very much, a sort of Jetsons futuristic level sort of car, really. It's kind of, it's aged badly. Citroen Saxo. I mean, this was the darling of the modifying crowd at the time when it first came out. They would do them up, they would put lurid lights on them, they would, you know, put spoilers on them, they would do whatever they could to make them interesting, exciting, and people loved them, and they were kind of cool. And you had the, what was it, the VTI? Saxo VTI was one of them. That was a pretty hot car, it was fun to drive, but look at it now. I mean, it just looks like an old little hatchback, doesn't it? It doesn't look anything special at all. And really, you'd be like, why would you have that? You know, at the time, yes. Today, it's just another has-been. Whoops. I'm sure there's going to be a few people out there going, what? I used to own one of those. I love that. Oh, put it in the comments. Right. I think, you know what? I think I probably upset enough people today. So I'm going to leave it there. And I'm going to now allow you the right of response in the comments. And I'm also going to ask you to put the cars that you think are no longer cool in the comments below. And I look forward to reading your comments. Make sure you hit like, make sure you're subscribing, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Shout out time, guys. Thank you so much. Hey, if you enjoy my content, why not get involved? Buy me a coffee. You can do that at either of these links. Or if you're watching on YouTube, buy me a thanks or take out a membership. It all helps. It really does.